All right, hello everyone and welcome to our first podcast. I'm Dr. Stephanie Russo. I'm a lecturer here in the English department at Macquarie University, and I'm here with Dr. Michelle Hammerdash, who also teaches in the English department at Macquarie University. Hi Michelle.
Hi Stephanie.
So in this podcast we're going to bring you a range of discussions about all things literary, including book reviews, discussions of all the big book news, such as reviews of prize-winning books as prizes are given out throughout the year. We'll have interviews and all sorts of other exciting bookish things. We're going to have a podcast for you about every 2 weeks, so make sure you subscribe to us via iTunes or Stitcher or Podcast Addict or however you listen to your podcasts these days. So today, since it's still roughly the beginning of the year, and it seems a really good time to do this, we're going to be talking about our favourite books of 2016. So we've chosen 3 each, and how this is going to work is that we're going to alternate titles. So Michelle, would you like to start with your first pick?
Yeah, absolutely, Steph. I love a good best of list. I think there's nothing like it for really crystallising both the year that we've lived and the books that are the product of that industry, which includes us as gatekeepers, which includes publishing companies, greed, economics, all of those forces that result in the books of any one year. So for me, I'm going to start with The Transmigration of Bodies by Yuri Herrera, which is a really compact novella that is something like it's noir, it's hard-boiled. You've got all the wonderful excess of that sort of gothic language and setting. We've got a city emptied by plague, and we're sort of tracing the mystery through the wonderful guise of a character unforgettably named the Redeemer, trying to bring to a peaceful end a standoff between 2 gangster families whose star-crossed lover children have died. And so in a sort of the afterlife of Romeo and Juliet, we have a sort of a Hitman-esque figure trying to detangle a situation that seems impossible to resolve in any other way than with bloodshed, and yet he does it.
I was actually reading this yesterday because you may have mentioned that you enjoyed this to me beforehand. So I found it very compelling. I thought it was very Raymond Chandler-esque, sort of Mexican Raymond Chandler. It's got that noir feel, it's got real grit. I love the names of the characters. So we have the Redeemer, 3 Times Blonde. We have the Unruly,
Neanderthal. And the Mennonite.
And the Mennonite, I've forgotten those.
the wonderful irony of a hitman pacifist, I think, full of paradox. In fact, I think Herrera is the master of nominative determinism, and I think it's that understanding of how to make language, how to maximise the impact of language, that makes this a short book but a compelling book, and one that has all of the richness that we expect from a novel, with its intertextuality, with its marvellous sort of themes of love, Cain and Abel, detective fiction, and yet also this freshness, which I think is something that I'm always looking for when I'm reading, because we are at a time when a lot of books that come out feel exhausted, and a lot of books that come out feel like they're trying too hard to be different, to be breaking new ground, whereas I think that Herrera's combination of language, irony, wit, because it's a funny book, and just unashamed sort of pastiche too, because he's not afraid to deploy a few 3 Times Blonde as a sort of a gesture towards the many influences that shape transmigration of bodies.
Yeah, and having said that, even though it is a book that is so clearly dependent on other texts, there's a lot of intertextual references to Romeo and Juliet, there is, I think, the Raymond Chandler nature of the book that I pointed to before is absolutely intentional. It still struck me as not like anything I'd read before.
I think sometimes a writer's ability to capture unexpected images, images that just sear, is perhaps sort of the very mark of a writer who you need to make place for on a list of best of. And I think one of the examples of that is this image of a pregnant 15-year-old wife of a lawyer, Gustavo, who's well into his 60s and is never going to discover the wisdom of old age thanks to Viagra. And instead we get this sort of really poignant glimpse of this girl fingering the ice cubes in the glass of her husband's drink as she prepares it in the kitchen alone, and we sort of get this sense of glimpsing into a sort of a behind the curtains scene, and I think it's the unexpected intimacy and the lyricism and also the inventiveness of sort of there's something at one and the same time illicit and yet also innocent about that scene, and I think that's where that freshness comes from, is because we have a reimagining of where innocence may come from. And in actual fact, I think one of the Redeemer's most redeeming qualities is this this optimism and this willingness to put himself on the line for something greater than himself. And I think that final image that the book leaves us with, of a character who, sort of with his shaking ribs and his, bleeding lips and, sort of having just tenderly carried the dead body of our Juliet baby girl back to her parents, is about to head back out into that plague-filled city to once again take on a new quest. And the only thing that he requires in order to recharge those rather tired batteries is a glimpse at the night sky. So I think it's a book that is redemptive as much as it is violent and apocalyptic.
That's what struck me as well, even though it is about violence and it's about death, and there is this plague that's overtaken the city and everyone's wearing masks in order to avoid contagion and scared of going outside and so forth. It struck me as very redemptive. It struck me as hopeful in the end, and I think the world might need a redeemer.
I think particularly a redeemer with a capital
R
with
redeemer.
a
That's
capital
right.
a capital R redeemer. And I think it is that glorious notion of the transmigration of bodies that perhaps so beautifully encapsulates what he's doing, where we most often think of transmigration as the movement of souls. And I think in a world where the movement of people is everywhere, so fraught, Herrera has given us an image of hope.
Absolutely, I agree. I thought it was gritty. I thought it was funny in unexpected ways, and as I said, unlike anything I'd ever read before, so it was a real standout for me.
What was your pick, Stephanie?
Well, my first pick is, again, a novel that seems to be speaking to the spirit of our times in a very specific way. It was actually chosen as an Oprah Book Club selection for 2016, so I'm in rarefied company. And that is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. So The Underground Railroad is about slavery in the early 19th century in the United States, prior to, of course, the Civil War. And even though it is somewhat a realist novel in that it purports to kind of give you a taste of the experience of a slave girl in that time, there's also a magical realist element to the novel, because while in reality the Underground Railroad was a network of people who helped smuggle slaves out of the South and into the North. In the novel, the Underground Railroad is an actual Underground Railroad that somehow, by means of some kind of magic, has been built underneath the cities of the South and runs all the way to the North. And so it's built by ex-slaves and sympathetic white people and so forth. What struck me about this book is that Colson Whitehead gives you the experience of his main character Cora on the plantation as a slave, and that's about as harrowing as you would expect it to be, although he writes with such a lightness of touch that it's never overwhelming, I think. But he also does an interesting thing, which is he uses this magical realist underground to take Cora to a number of cities around the South and in the end quite north in America, in the United States, in order to kind of compare the way that race and that race is treated, or the idea of racism has pervaded that particular city or that particular society. So even when Cora feels that she's in a kind of superior position than when she was a slave, so she goes, for example, to South Carolina and she works as a nanny, but she finds that in reality that ingrained prejudice, that perception about African Americans is still just as debilitating in that city as it was on the plantation. And so what he does is he actually takes all of these things that were happening throughout the 19th century, makes them happen contemporaneously, so he plays around with history a bit. But what he enables you to do is not just understand what the experience of being a slave on a plantation in the South was like, but also as a woman trying to make her way in the world where all of the social forces are against her. I thought it was beautifully written. There's a lightness of touch about it. Like I said, it's about the most harrowing experiences that you can imagine, but I did not find it depressing or ponderous. I thought his writing was evocative and expressive in the best possible way, and in a way the kind of lightness of the writing really draws your attention to the horror of what is happening to Cora. So it's what's not said that's really where the horror lies in the book. I thought it was an important book for our times. I think it really taps into a lot of conversations that are happening around race in the United States at the moment. I think it's important that it's a woman character, because the experience of a female slave is something that he's very specific about, the specific horrors that are faced by a female slave. And I thought it was just an amazing read. I'm pleased that I read it, and it's the book that in 2016 that probably stuck with me the longest and that I haven't been able to sort of stop thinking about.
Look, I'm really hoping that you'll lend me that after.
Just don't expect a fun read with lots of laughs.
No, but I think this is the thing that makes us so committed to literature, is that most often what is required of any one time is actually first and foremost a leap of the mind. And I think that's what fiction shows us, is that in understanding the degree to which so much of the realities that dictate our behaviours are very much based on fictions and perceptions and the ability and sort of that knowing and not knowing. So I'm listening to you talk about Whitehead, present us with sort of situations where the character is subjected to just as much sort of racism in supposedly free situations and societies as she was under slavery. And I think that it's those mind frame shifts that are so powerful and that literature does so well. And that's why I think, although you may see a sort of apocalyptic theme emerging in my choices, I'm actually going to put forward Michelle T's Black Wave as a second best of for 2016. And I think that there are a number of reasons why I've done that, and one of them is because she imagines the worst. Some of the images of a sort of roiling sea with fumes so toxic that merely walking by the sea is actually going to sort of shrivel your cerebellum, as well as sort of these expanses as the character who starts off in San Francisco. My geography is not so great. He starts off in San Francisco and ends up in Los Angeles, and there's such playfulness in her writing, and so we are immersed in this marvelous microcosm of characters who are colourful, who are often either drug addicts or actually just dabbling recreationally, which I think is certainly the line that the character Michelle, sort of a self-referential and sort of a well-used trope of having a character the same name as our author, because this is all about playing with memoir, with autobiography, and fiction, of course, really just makes a stamp on sort of a genre of literature that has often sort of with William Burroughs and Kerouac and Ginsberg, the likes, been marked by men. And I think Michelle T does a superb job of infusing the whole narrative with this wonderful joyousness, really, and then these startling glimpses of a world that you only by bits and pieces begin to realise is not the world that we live in, our real world, but in actual fact her descriptions of environmental damage are close enough to being commensurate with the way we're living today, that at first I think you do actually read them as perhaps realism, and only later come to realise as we drive through Auschwitz, which is actually just an absolute destroyed landscape that you can't drive through for the smell, and in fact it is aptly observed that probably the last food stuff of humans will be the hamburger from the fast food joint, and so we have this sort of compelling narrative that explores love, and then also the very end, and most intriguingly, writing itself.
I think that there's a common theme running through our picks, and that is that sense of imminent disaster, imminent tragedy, perhaps imminent apocalypse, but also a kind of a lightness as well, and a freshness, and a hopefulness. Yeah,
absolute pessimism, and I think one of the wonderful things that she does, because it's so very playful, and so she will actually bow to the will of her characters who don't want to be part of her memoir. So her lovers who say, whatever you do, don't write me in. I don't want to be written in, because she plays with the idea of autobiography. And then so she explores what happens if she takes out the lover who saved her. And what happens is that she becomes an alcoholic. And so quickly this character needs to be written back in to prevent her from a descent into alcoholism, which of course is the most unprohibited of drugs. So it's not her dabbling with heroin or cocaine or any of the other forms of narcotics that she does in the first part of the novel, but rather it is alcoholism that ultimately very nearly brings her to an end. So I think there's a very, very savvy playfulness to her relationships, to her determination to flaunt to flaunt her very, very sort of avant-garde approach to writing, which has this marvellous sort of comic book feel to it, with capitalized dialogue from our I want to say narrator, but she's not our narrator because it's third person, despite the memoir. And there's just the colour and the ear for argot, which I think all writers have to have in order to bring us books that make us drop everything and read.
Well, that sounds like it's very genre bending, doesn't it?
Well, yes, the point at which you get to the second part of the book, where she sort of flees Los Angeles, where she flees San Francisco to arrive in Los Angeles, which is where she of course awaits the end, is indeed a complete act of unwriting everything that you've read in good faith in the first section. So a wonderful read, I think.
That sounds fascinating. I may have to pick that up from you too. So my next pick was Zadie Smith's Swing Time. So that came out relatively recently, late in 2016. And so Swing Time is about two friends, and it takes them throughout the early days of their friendship as quite young children, up until when they're around 30 to 40 years of age. So the narrator is unnamed, and the character of the narrator I think is quite interesting. And she meets her friend Tracy in dance class. And the book Swing Time takes its title from the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers musical. And so they meet in dance class, and the narrator is not a particularly proficient dancer but wants to be, and Tracy is a very proficient dancer. And it maps out the course of their friendship. The narrator becomes the assistant to a kind of Madonna, kind of Kylie character who decides that she needs to save the world and set up a school in Africa. And Tracy becomes a dancer, but a sort of down on her luck, not very successful dancer in musicals. I loved the book really because of its portrayal of female friendship, the ambiguities of that relationship between the unnamed narrator and Tracy. I thought, again, it was an interesting examination of race. Both of the characters are mixed race, but one has a white mother and one has a white father, one has a black mother and black father, so they're in a different kind of relationship to their racial identity. So I just thought it was compellingly written. I thought it was an interesting exploration of really a lot of aspects of contemporary culture. So, for example, celebrity culture, social media, technology, all of these really contemporary ideas are handled with a real deftness of touch by Zadie Smith, and it also asks some interesting questions and is quite problematic in areas which I think you found, because I suspect you read this.
Stephanie, I absolutely was up far too late last night for me, well past midnight and well past my general bed time.
That was my fault. I did lend it to you.
You did lend it to me, and I did finish it at about 1 a.m. last night. So I have not had time for the settling process to occur. So I think where I am at the moment with my reading is that on one hand I can completely and utterly recognise the satire that's going on, and I can completely and utterly understand the idea of that really sort of unreliable, somewhat apathetic and almost listless first-person narrator vocalizer as a literary device. One that draws attention to what does actually happen to a generation when they become completely anaesthetised by too much exposure to social media, television, etc., etc. So I can absolutely understand that, sort of what we're getting with that narrator, who in actual fact doesn't have a lot of insight into other characters.
No.
I kept feeling, there's a flatness to these characters. There's a sort of a rather lacklusterness to the narration sometimes. And I'm thinking, is this a sort of a new aesthetic? You know, is
An
this
aesthetic
something
of flatness.
Yeah, is this, well, you know, is this an aesthetic that is actually doing something and underpinning a more profound idea about, you know, what are the consequences of, you know, sort of of humans when we lose our idiosyncrasy and we lose our you know, sort of our decisiveness and our passion. And is she in actual fact, is Zadie Smith in actual fact brave in portraying Hawa, an African Muslim character who sort of over the course of the novel becomes a more and more sort of ardent, in fact marries into a sort of a modern Islam, which, you know, sort of Zadie Smith very consciously references as a modern Islam, characterised by sort of gendered clothing and a sort of an ascetic drive that takes Hawa out of the hub of her sort of dancing musical family, and Zadie Smith sort of really does portray Hawa with that same sort of flatness, as she portrays you know, sort of the estate back in London, or her mother, or all of those things, and so is that sort of does that create a sort of an ethical, a very much sort of homogenous response to obviously really quite controversial and difficult moments in time and subject matters that people are finding difficult to write about? Or is it just an example of Zadie Smith producing a sort of rather ordinary summary narration?
Well, I think that this might sound like a bit of a sitting on both sides of the fence answer, but I think it's actually both, because I think that what she does is she does flatten the narration to the point where you don't really get much sense of the narrator at all throughout the entire book, even though we have, you know, 300 and something pages of reading what's going on inside her head. We don't get that much of a sense of what's inside her head at all. She's only ever reacting to the people around her in quite a kind of flat manner. So I think that there is a sense there that this could be kind of anybody. This is you, this is anybody. So there's like a reader stand-in kind of relationship facilitated. But I also think that what she's doing is allowing you to observe all of these aspects of contemporary society through the eyes of this very kind of affectless narrator, and allow you to kind of come to your own conclusions about all of these things that are happening in the book. So, for example, the Amy, the celebrity pop star that the unnamed narrator works for, has this kind of white saviour mentality towards Africa, where she's going to go in and she's going to, you know, set up a school and save the Africans from themselves. But of course she's fetishizing this community as much as she's doing anything else. She takes one as her lover, and that sort of facilitates the breakdown of her relationship with the unnamed narrator. So I think that what she's doing is obviously quite purposive. She's doing this kind of very flat narration for a reason. But I think what it does, for me, it allowed me to kind of engage with the other characters more without kind of taking on the attitude that the narrator takes on, if that makes sense. So I didn't feel I was guided in a particular way by the narrator because of her very flat affect. For example, her mother, the narrator's mother, is a very ambitious woman, and very interested in rising above kind of where she sits in the social hierarchy. And the narrator as a child can't understand why she's not more interested in being a mother, and why she's very much interested in education and so forth. And I thought that the way the narrator relates to her mother really allowed you to see the mother in a different way than you might necessarily see, you know, a mother who neglects her child, who doesn't seem very interested in being a mother. So I thought that there was a kind of playing with focus that allowed me to enter into the book more fully.
So there was a sort of an almost escaping, because in some sense she's got fairly archetypal / stereotypical figures in many respects.
Absolutely, yeah.
The pop star diva,
yeah.
the the mother, the overachieving mother, or sort of the exceptional mother. I think she's an exceptional woman in terms of sort of intellect and drive, whatever one might think of. Or whatever the narrator thought of her mothering. So I guess in some sense, as you say, that affectless, sort of style certainly allowed us to both recognise that stereotype, and yet at the same time, I guess, extricate it from a lot of the sort of the value laden sort of context that surround those sorts of figures. So I think that there was a definite, sort of effort to acknowledge that, sort of the value systems that shape so much of the way that we respond to characters in fiction, which of course have a history and a politics, and that's why I was so and it may take me at least a week or two to work out where I'm going to come down on this one, as a sort of as an aesthetics of flattening, where we have this sort of egalitarian representation of all the characters, regardless of whether sort of we have whether we have a sort of a Muslim zealot, or whether we have a pop star diva, or whether we have sort of the mother in Parliament, or whether sort of in actual fact, in concept, that is incredibly fascinating, but what happens in the practice and in the experience of reading, and how do we distinguish between some passages that really did feel very ordinary, where I think that there was over explaining, where there was oversimplifying. I mean, there's a sort of a thank you to the text that she used in order to research the work that she did, or the section in Africa, and I guess in that section in the village, I was very much, for a long time, sort of, and I guess perhaps it is once again purposive, marooned, and so is it the ultimate in a sort of a stylistic decision that does precisely and successfully what it intended to do.
Well, I think that the narrator is marooned, really, because she's surrounded by all of these people who, even though they sort of fall into these broad stereotypes, they're also extremely strong, decisive characters in the way that she's not. So her mother has a very kind of clear path through life. Tracy, in her determination to dance and in her experiences, has a very kind of strong personality and will, and she doesn't, and she never really comes to terms with her identity at all, because she just sort of floats through life and sort of latches on to whatever is sort of happening around her. So, for example, she latches on to dance, yet we're told repeatedly that she's not a very good dancer, and that she just doesn't have that ability that she so sort of craves. And then in her relationship with Amy, again, she's drawn to the charisma of the celebrity. She's drawn to the kind of lifestyle, that very kind of rarefied, luxurious lifestyle, but she's periphery to that lifestyle. She's only ever a hanger-on, and she realises, far too late, that her connection to that lifestyle can be severed extremely quickly and extremely easily. And so I guess that what I found is that I was quite drawn to that and sympathetic to that kind of lack of identity and lack of understanding where she fits into the world. I thought that was an interesting comment on the world today and all of the different things that pull on your identity, and that drifting feeling that a lot of people, I think, experience of not quite knowing where they fit into the world, what their relationship is to those around them. She doesn't even really have a good understanding of her relationship to Tracy, who is her, childhood best friend, who she's grown up with, and she has very ambivalent feelings towards her, which I think is quite a realistic portrayal of female friendship. But I also think, again, underlines the fact that she hasn't come to grips with who she is. She hasn't come to grips with where she is in the world. She doesn't really understand what she's doing. She seems to make decisions that are strange, inexplicable, and I think that your feeling of being marooned in the novel is, I think, Zadie Smith putting you in that position of the narrator. So I think it's a quite clever tactic to make you feel as sort of driftless and unsure as a narrator, but I can see absolutely how that might alienate readers.
Look, it's a fascinating book, and as I say, I was up in the wee hours of the morning, which are the wee hours for me.
Any book that can keep you up to 1 a.m.
Precisely.
I think is a great book.
Absolutely. And so what was your final choice?
Well, anybody who knows me knows that I love, adore and worship Margaret Atwood. So my final choice for today is Hagseed by Margaret Atwood.
Snap.
So we have some overlap here, don't we?
We do indeed. So what for you, just saying?
Well, Hagseed is part of the Hogarth Shakespeare series, which is a series that Hogarth Press has been releasing, where famous novelists such as Margaret Atwood, Anne Tyler's done one,
Jeanette
Winterson's done another, thank you, where they take on Shakespeare plays and turn them into novels. And the way that Margaret Atwood has done this is to take The Tempest, that's the play that she's chosen, and turn it into a story about a very embittered man who has been at the head of a theatre company, and he's pushed out of his theatre company by his rival, and then later on, after a period of time basically sulking, he starts working in a prison and puts on a production of The Tempest in the prison with the prisoners, playing all of the characters except for Miranda, who comes in, who is a outside actress who comes in to help them. So it's partly about putting on this play, The Tempest, but it partly restages The Tempest in this man's story. So I thought it was clever. I thought it was funny, as with Atwood. It's very kind of witty, and there's a lot of there are a lot of lines that leap out of you as only Atwood could do. And I thought that it was the most successful of the Hogarth Shakespeares. I think I've read them all now, and this one is by far my favourite. I think she was very clever to actually set the novel around a production of The Tempest, because without kind of, having to tell you all of this or writing an essay about The Tempest, she managed to make me want to go back to The Tempest and reread it with the insights that this novel gave me in mind, which I think is the kind of ultimate thing that these adaptations should do.
Look, I adored Hagseed, and I think that there were so many reasons for that. I think that she really, because Felix, our Prospero character, is very much devastated at the opening in ways that seem almost unimaginable. In fact, that opening of the book, I was thinking, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to sustain this over, the next few hundred pages, where, sort of in the space of a few pages, he loses his wife and then his toddler daughter, which, we all know through Shakespeare and through our literary training. You do something to a child, and sort of the affect meter just hits the, you sort of your reader is at your mercy, pretty much. And I think for me as well, because we have this wonderful creative extravaganza occurring inside the prison, and that is probably that central theme that's introduced and reintroduced and thought and rethought. I think that the play is, and indeed the in Atwood's reimagining of it, she very much taps into the world of today with this questioning of legitimate and illegitimate power, and also the types of scheming, the Machiavellian machinations that at one and the same time fascinate, compel, and yet also cause the reader some real dis-ease towards the end, when they do feel as though they are slipping into the realm of being repellent. And we're really worried about what line Felix is going to walk with his revenge, because it is a revenge play.
Well, I think that's what's so interesting
I keep calling
about
it play, novel.
Well, I think that's what's so interesting is that you do go along with Felix for large amounts of the novel, and she does build sympathy for this character who has lost so much, and he's lost his wife, he's lost his child, he's lost his job, and he's really his identity. But then he's going so far with his revenge in that he's using the Tempest as a way of getting back on his enemies. He's using this staging of the Tempest, and you realise as you're reading the description of this production that's happening in the prison, you realise that if you're in that situation of experiencing the play and the way they use the prison as a kind of labyrinth in order to trap certain characters in the prison in various iterations, you think, my God, this is just over the top. But then I think that Felix backs down in a way too, which again is exactly what happens in The Tempest. It is a revenge play, and Prospero does not go to the extremes in that play that he could with his revenge plot. He sort of dials it back a bit and has a kind of change of heart. So I think that that's interesting, because the way she manages sympathy for Felix and the way she manages that feeling of like this is all just gone a little bit too far is very clever. I really love the way she maps the island onto the prison. So the island in the of The Tempest, she maps into the prison. It's a mysterious place. She makes the prison into a mysterious kind of labyrinthine place. She makes the prison into this place that is, it's confined. It's a prison, right? But at the same time, there seems to be potential there, because all of these people are coming into contact with art and literature in ways that excite them and stimulate them in ways that they would never expect. So it's a place of both confinement, as the island in The Tempest is, and also magic.
Look, I think that we found that in all of our books we were sort of looking at sort of this hopefulness emerging out of pessimism, and you sort of get this mise en abîme.
Yeah.
In that sense that we have Felix who is destroyed and takes himself off to a hut in it's got to be a Robinson Crusoe-esque endeavour to sort of beard and all.
Haven't we all wanted to take ourselves off to a hut?
Absolutely. And in the Canadian winter, no less.
Maybe not that.
And so he is a man who has had everything taken from him. Everything. And then we have this sort of descent into an underworld, because we are passing through, we are offering our coins as we pass through the gates into the underworld. I can't remember the two characters who are
who act as the prison guards.
And then of course we're entering into this. And I think this is one of the powerful things that literature does, is it reminds us of it reminds us of the forgotten potentials of our stories and our myths, and it reminds us that the things that we think we're experiencing for the first time are actually things that in sort of different guises have been confronted by humans since the beginning. And I keep coming back to this idea of legitimate and illegitimate power, because I think of sort of on one hand the members of Parliament, Tony and I think it's Sal, with their scheming and their successful sort of bids for power and their control and their step-by-step movement up the ladder of legitimate power by...
And their ousting of Felix in a very deliberate way, yeah.
And then on the other hand, we've got Felix in completely and utterly in exile, working away on his own sort of machinations and schematics in order to reap his revenge upon them. And I think that what we see is that just as we had Plato, who thought of democracy as a theatrocracy, how would you say that? A theaterocracy, with all of the puppeteering and the terrifying risk of politics being transformed into a stage. And then, of course, we've got all those magnificent lines from Shakespeare and Macbeth. You know, the fool. And all the world's a stage, and all of these marvellous lines that keep reminding us of both the power within imagining things, and that in actual fact it's often from those unexpected locations that have been relegated to the hopeless, where indeed hope does emerge.
Well, that's what Felix is doing. He's staging his power, isn't he? He's using the actual play of The Tempest, or his staging of the play of The Tempest, as a manifestation of his power. This is the power that he has, and he's going to use it in order to overcome or overturn their kinds of power, their more legitimate, more government-sanctioned forms of power. But I think that one thing that also struck me about this novel is that it's so hopeful about the power of literature, and we are teachers, we're educators, and who doesn't love the idea that reading Shakespeare or reading literature in general is going to change somebody's life?
What a fantastic teacher is Felix. So despite the fact that his motivations may have been somewhere beyond, the classroom, which has in itself interesting parallels with academia, I think what he does in that classroom is magic, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And I think
those scenes are magical.
One of the masterstrokes of Atwood, and I think is those final reimaginings where each of the prisoner has their turn as their final term paper.
That's right.
In giving the reader their take on what would actually happen after the play ends. And I think that there are so many marvelous possibilities for the significance of that act, where Atwood isn't afraid of going on too long. She isn't afraid of thinking what happens after the final full stop, after the curtain drops. And most importantly, she understands that power of literature, that as you're reading the story of Legs, I think Legs is one of the characters, and how he imagined what would happen on their way back. You realise that there's this incredible levelling power of literature when there is no way of distinguishing that level of storytelling of Legs as from everything that happened in the story up to that point. And as a masterstroke, I think that was brilliant.
And there's such a human impulse too to think about what happened after. Right, we all do it, and I mean, it sounds kind of infantile, but it's something we all do.
What we tell our students not to do.
That's right, but we all do it. We think about, okay, this happened, this might have happened, this I hope this happened, I hope this didn't happen. And so she just goes along with that and takes you through in her usual style and wit and cleverness. If you have a chance, I actually heard Margaret Atwood perform the raps that the characters perform in the book, which is an experience that you surely have to share with me, because hearing Margaret Atwood rap is life-changing and magical. I think that is probably where we'll wrap up for today, with that image of Margaret Atwood rapping, which is the best image I can possibly think about. Thank you, Michelle, and we'll see you back here in 2 weeks.